Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. This is a program for you to pass the time of the day and have a little bit of information. We're all about economics and some of the economic impacts and effects of various decisions. It's not necessarily a political show. It's not a medical show, but we do talk about issues that impact you politically and medically, that affect you economically, and some of the results of that. And so, it's we try to focus on the finance and economics, the number side. My name is Mark Brechbill, and I'm a CPA, so that's why, and an ex-banker, so that's why I like to focus on the numbers side of it. But it's primarily a community service program to get you to think about some of the things that are going on and some of the economic impacts. A lot of people are not, brought up in an economic environment. Unless you choose that profession, and a lot of people hate math and they hate economics and they hate finance, and I understand that. I've spent a lot of time doing it. I hate it most days too. But anyway, but it is interesting, and it's always kind of fun and interesting to take an economic perspective of something. Along those same lines, one of the things that we deal with quite a bit in economics is statistics, and that is also something that is kind of good to understand. In my business as an auditor, because as a CPA, I do a fair amount of financial statement work. And a lot of people don't realize this, but when a CPA audits a company, a condo, or a business, we can't, most of the time, we can't look at 100% of the transactions. We don't look at everything that takes place. We determine scopes. In other words, we determine levels which below that level, we're not as concerned about it because it's not material. Now, if there's a bunch of those that add up, it can become material. So we also look at, large numbers of transactions, and we do that statistically by doing statistical samples. And so, it's kind of an interesting thing in the accounting and finance world in terms of some of the things we look at. But so today, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the subject that all of us love and hate, and that is the coronavirus. But I told you it's not a medical show, so I'm going to focus only on the economic and statistical portion of the process, and I'll leave the other stuff up to the politicians and the other people. But I think it's important to understand all of the various risk factors that we're dealing with any kind of medical situation. Because sometimes it's broader than just the health impact. And so that's kind of what I'd like to deal with today. 220-9788 is the number in the studio, 220-WSTU. And of course, welcome any calls. And anything anybody wants to join in the conversation. One of the things that you like to look at when you're looking at any kind of economic data is, how reliable is the source? When you're looking at statistics, how appropriate is the sample size? Are you sampling an appropriate or the whole population? That's always important for us as auditors, is when we statistically sample, we have to make sure we've got the full population that we're testing from. Because if we don't, then our test will be off, our statistics will be wrong, and we won't be able to have the same level of confidence. The other thing that's important in anything is, what is the credentials of the person that's talking about it or that's dealing with it, and what relevance do those credentials have? I said, before the show started, that my background is in finance, accounting, and banking, and so my economic and accounting and statistical background is generally related to that, and some of the educational courses I've had there and the continuing education that I've had there, and then so that's where I come from. But what I wanted to I don't normally get into reading something uh, because that can be kind of boring. But I did want to discuss something that relates to statistics, but it has to do with the virus because we're hearing a lot of numbers thrown around out there, and I always love it when they throw numbers around. Is uh, the percentage of deaths, the percentage of the population, the percentage of this, percentage of that. And, the percentage is made up of, in this case, let's say percentage of deaths is made up of two numbers. One, the number of people that have actually died, which early on in this thing, we were having trouble getting those numbers because China wasn't really very forthcoming. So we were having a hard time pinning down the actual numbers of death. And along those same lines, um, not only is it the number of deaths, but it is the number of deaths that are a result of the coronavirus or COVID-19. And so some people could have had the COVID-19 virus, but not died of it. They could have died of, for example, Hep A. We've got a huge population or outbreak of Hep A in Martin County. Go onto the health department's website and look at it. It's far greater than anything else, flu, coronavirus, or anything else. Hep A, and we've had more deaths from Hep A than traditional. So again, you have to look at so there's the number of deaths, and then it's whether those deaths are accurate, and whether they're actually caused by the virus. Without proper testing, it's pretty hard to determine what actually caused the deaths. But, anecdotal, we have statistics, and we can look at some of that. The other side of it, the big side of it, is what is the population? And is that the whole population? And does it include everybody that potentially has had the COVID-19 or the coronavirus? And that's another thing that's hard to determine because they're saying that a large portion of this, particularly in the younger people, a large portion of this, comes out as basically a cold, not even really a bad cold. And some of the people, don't really realize that they've had it. In fact, we're starting to see some celebrities, which is always kind of good because that kind of leads to some education. We're starting to see some celebrities who all of a sudden are saying, "Hey, I had it, and I didn't know I had it." For example, there was a couple basketball players that were tested for it because they were testing the NBA. So they got tested and they had no idea they had it, and they tested positive. They really didn't have any symptoms from it. And they didn't end up having any outcome that was negative from it. They really were kind of surprised that they had it. So, and that kind of makes sense because the virus itself in a healthy person doesn't have as much of an impact generally. I think 98% of the deaths have been with people 60 and over. I think 70. I forget what the other numbers are, but anyway. So I was gonna go through this with just to kind of, and this is good. This is interesting information. You can just add it to your repertoire. You don't have to believe it if you don't want to. I'm going to start off by telling you who it is, who wrote this article, because I think it's important to understand that, this isn't just me or somebody local that just made this stuff up. It's not even the governor or anybody else. This information comes from a guy named Dr. John Ioannidis. He's a professor of medicine, of epidemiology and population health, of biomedical data science, and of statistics at Stanford University, and co-director of Stanford's Meta Research Innovation Center. So, he's kind of got some background in statistics, background in health. He's a doctor, a professor of medicine. So I think it's kind of interesting that he's got some credibility, and particularly credibility as a statistician in the health industry, which I thought was kind of interesting. So, and if anybody's wanting to, get this at some point, it's in something called statnews.com. STATNEWS.com is the website that it's on. So, the title of the article probably should is called A Fiasco in the Making. As the coronavirus pandemic takes hold, we are making decisions without reliable data. And this was written yesterday, so it's current, at least. So he says the current coronavirus disease, COVID-19, has been called a once in a century pandemic, but it may also be a once in a century evidence fiasco. At a time when everyone needs better information, from disease modelers and governments to people quarantined or just social distancing, we lack reliable evidence on how many people have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, which is the uh, the actual virus, or who continue to become infected. Better information is needed to guide decisions and actions of monumental significance and to monitor their impact. Draconian countermeasures have been adopted in many countries. If the pandemic dissipates, either on its own or because of these measures, short term extreme social distancing and lockdowns may be bearable. How long, though, should measures like these be continued if the pandemic churns across the globe unabated? How can policymakers tell if they are doing more good than harm? Vaccines or affordable treatments take many months or even years to develop and test properly. Given such timelines, the consequences of long term lockdowns are entirely unknown. The data collected so far on how many people are infected and how the epidemic is evolving are utterly unreliable. Given the limited testing to date, some deaths and probably the vast majority of infections due to SARS-CoV-2 are being missed. We don't know if we are failing to capture infections by a factor of 3 or 300. 3 months out after the outbreak emerged, most countries, including the US, lack the ability to test a large number of people, and no countries have reliable data on the prevalence of the virus in a representative random sample of the general population. And he's going to get into explaining that as to why. This evidence fiasco creates tremendous uncertainty about the risk of dying from COVID-19. Reported case fatality rates, like the official 3.4% rate from the World Health Organization, cause horror and are meaningless. Patients who have been tested for COVID-19 for the virus are disproportionately those with severe symptoms and bad outcomes. As most health systems have limited testing capacity, selection bias may even worsen in the near future. And what they're getting at there is that the only people are getting tested are the people that have evidence that they have it, that know for sure that they have it. And those are the ones that have probably got more of the extreme symptoms than those people who have it, don't know they really have it, and never show up at the testing facility. The one situation where an entire closed population was tested was the Diamond Princess cruise ship and its quarantine passengers. The case fatality rate there was 1%, but this was a largely elderly population in which the death rate from COVID-19 is much higher. Projecting the Diamond Princess mortality rate onto the age structure of the U.S. population, the death rate among people infected with COVID-19 would be 0.125%, not 1.25, but 0.125%. But since this estimate is based on extremely thin data, there were just 7 deaths among the 700 infected passengers and crew. The real death rate could stretch from 5 times lower, which would be 0.025, to 5 times higher, 0.625. Again, these are points. Nothing's at 1% yet. It is also possible that some of the passengers who were infected might die later, and that tourists may have different frequencies of chronic diseases, a risk factor for worse outcomes with the infection than the general population. Adding these extra sources of uncertainty, reasonable estimates for the case fatality ratio in the general U.S. population vary from 0.05% to 1%. So that's what the fatality ratio would be based on the general population. That huge range markedly affects how severe the pandemic is and what should be done. A population-wide case fatality rate of 0.05% is lower than seasonal influenza. If that is the true rate, locking down the world with potentially tremendous social and financial consequences may be totally irrational. It's like an elephant being attacked by a house cat. Frustrated and trying to avoid the cat, the elephant accidentally jumps off a cliff and dies. Could the COVID-19 case fatality rate be that low? No, some say, pointing to the high rate in elderly people. However, even some so-called mild or common cold type coronaviruses that have been known for decades can have case fatality rates as high as 8% when they infect elderly people in nursing homes. In fact, such mild, in quotations, coronaviruses infect tens of millions of people every year and account for 3% to 11% of those hospitalized in the U.S. with lower respiratory infections each winter. These mild coronaviruses may be implicated in several thousands of deaths every year worldwide, though the vast majority of them are not documented with precise testing. Instead, they are lost as noise among 60 million deaths from various causes every year. Although successful surveillance systems have long existed for influenza, the disease is confirmed by a laboratory in a tiny minority of cases. In the U.S., for example, so far this season, 1,073,976 specimens have been tested, and 222,552, or 20.7%, have tested positive for influenza. That's not coronavirus, that's influenza. So they've only produced samples of about a million, and about 222,000 of them, or 20%, have tested positive for influenza. In the same period, the estimated number of influenza-like illnesses is between 36 million and 51 million, with an estimated 22,000 to 55,000 flu deaths. So they're only testing a very small sample, even in everything they're doing. Note the uncertainty about influenza-like illness deaths, a 2.5-fold range corresponding to tens of thousands of deaths. Every year, some of these deaths are due to influenza and some to other viruses like common cold coronaviruses. In an autopsy series that tested for respiratory viruses in specimens from 57 elderly persons who died during the 2016 to 2017 influenza season, influenza viruses were detected in 18% of the specimens, while any kind of respiratory virus was found in 47%. In some people who die from viral respiratory pathogens, more than one virus is found upon autopsy, and bacteria are often superimposed. A positive test for coronavirus does not mean necessarily that this virus is always primarily responsible for a patient's demise. If we assume that case fatality rate among individuals affected by the virus is 0.3% in the general population, that's a mid-range guess from my Diamond Princess analysis, and that 1% of the U.S. population gets infected, about 3.3 million people, this would translate to about 10,000 deaths. This sounds like a huge number, but it is buried within the noise of the estimate of deaths from influenza-like illness. If we had not known about a new virus out there and had not checked individuals with PCR tests, the number of total deaths due to influenza-like illness would not seem unusual this year. At most, we might have casually noted that flu this season seems to be a bit worse than average. The media coverage would have been less than for an NBA game between the two most indifferent teams. Some worry that the 68 deaths from COVID-19 in the U.S. as of March 16th will increase exponentially to 680, 6,800, 68,000, 680,000, along with similar catastrophic patterns around the globe. Is that a realistic scenario or bad science fiction? How can we tell at what point such a curve might stop? The most valuable piece of information for answering these questions would be to know the current prevalence of the infection in a random sample of a population, and to repeat this exercise at regular time intervals to estimate the incidence of new infections. Sadly, that's information we don't have. In the absence of data, prepare for the worst reasoning leads to extreme measures of social distancing and lockdowns. Unfortunately, we do not know if these measures work. School closures, for example, may reduce transmission rates, but they may also backfire if children socialize anyhow. If school closures lead children to spend more time with susceptible elderly family members, if children at home disrupt their parents' ability to work, and more. School closures may also diminish the chances of developing herd immunity in an age group that has spared serious illness or serious disease. I'm just stop there. That was interesting. Something I hadn't really thought about is, the schools are shutting down and trying to talk about doing some sort of distance learning, but how do they do that, particularly among elementary age kids? Somebody's got to be there to help them. Well, the parents are working. So when parents have kids and their parents are here local, the grandparents are here local, who ends up filling in when there's an emergency and we need to take care of our grandkids? Well, we do. Those of us that are grandparents. Well, we're the population that's at risk. So in potentially, you know, shutting down the schools is going to force more risk on us as the population this is going to fall on, because either our kids are going to have to make a decision to not work and then they don't have any income coming in so they can't take care of their kids, or they've got to get somebody to fill in and they probably can't afford to pay a babysitter. So in general, particularly among the population that can least afford it, this is going to fall on older caregivers. I know it's true in my office. Just as an example, one of my employees in the office, who's a grandmother, her family lives with her. If the only way her kids could do this is if she stays home for some period of time. So, and takes care of the kids. So anyway, it's kind of so I just wanted to make that point. School closures may also diminish the chances of developing herd immunity. This has been the perspective behind the different stance of the United Kingdom, keeping schools open, at least until as I write this. In the absence of data on the real course of the epidemic, we don't know whether this perspective was brilliant or catastrophic. Flattening the curve to avoid overwhelming the health system is conceptually sound, in theory. A visual that has become viral in media and social media shows how flattening the curve reduces the volume of the epidemic that is above the threshold of what the health system can handle at any moment. Yet, if the health system does become overwhelmed, the majority of the extra deaths may not be due to coronavirus, but to other common diseases and conditions, such as heart attacks, strokes, trauma, bleeding, and the like, that are not adequately treated. If the level of epidemic does overwhelm the health system and extreme measures have only modest effectiveness, then flattening the curve may make things worse. Instead of being overwhelmed during a short acute phase, the health system will remain overwhelmed for a more protracted period. That's another reason we need data about the exact level of the epidemic activity. One of the bottom lines is that we don't know how long social distancing measures and lockdowns can be maintained without major consequences to the economy, society, and mental health. Unpredictable evolutions may ensue, including financial crisis, unrest, civil strife, war, and a meltdown of the social fabric. At a minimum, we need unbiased prevalence and incidence data for the evolving infectious load to guide decision-making. In the most pessimistic scenario, which I do not espouse, if the new coronavirus infects 60% of the global population and 1% of the infected population die, that will translate into more than 40 million deaths globally, matching the 1918 influenza pandemic. The vast majority of this hectocomb would be people with limited life expectancies. That's in contrast to 1918, when many young people died. One can only hope that, much like in 1918, life will continue. Conversely, with lockdowns of months, if not years, life largely stops. Short-term and long-term consequences are entirely unknown, and billions, not just millions of lives, may be eventually at stake. If we decide to jump off the cliff, we need some data to inform us about the rationale of such an action and the chances of landing somewhere safe. So that's from, again, John Ioannidis, professor of medicine, of epidemiology and population health, of biomedical data science, and of statistics at Stanford University, and co-director of Stanford's Meta Research Innovation Center. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Just as a note, there are some people that left comments, and there was pretty much in general some recognition of what's going on there and the issues relative to statistics. So one of the comments I thought was interesting is the point about random sampling is actually right on the money. Instead of testing people with pronounced symptoms, 10,000 random tests would provide a statistically relevant sampling of the population, although such a test would ideally need to factor in those who have had it as well as got it. Evidence that the virus is most infectious before symptoms, and evidence that some 50 to 75% of infected are asymptomatic, completely skews the interpretation. A simple single statistical sampling would shed more light on the problem than other research at this point. So Anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. There's comments posted from all over the world. So I thought it was kind of an interesting comment. Here was one comment that I thought was interesting and I haven't checked this out, and I don't know who this person is, so I have no idea. But it's from a guy named Rob who posted it this morning. Thank you for this thoughtful article. Donovan Mitchell, the 23-year-old basketball player who tested positive, said that he had no symptoms and felt like he could play a 7-game series tomorrow. He was tested only because he was an NBA player that had been in contact with others. In fact, several other players who tested positive also have no symptoms. It's likely that tens of thousands of people or more are currently infected with either mild or no symptoms, which, if true, would bring the mortality down drastically. Italy is a country of 60 million. There are around 32,000 confirmed cases with 2,500 deaths. According to reports, the average age of these deaths is approximately 80 years old. This chart from Global Data Healthcare as of March 13th shows that 56% of the deaths in Italy are 80 or older, 88% are over 70, and 98% are over 60. So it is drastically skewed towards the older population, which is, of course, more at risk because they have more health issues. The testing in Italy has not been widespread. It's a virtual certainty that many, many more people are infected, which again brings the death rate down. Iran is currently under crippling sanctions and is short on medical supplies. China has a massive percentage of cigarette smokers, which is a risk factor. South Korea is getting things under control. They implemented a testing regime that makes the U.S. look like a third world country. By doing so, they have so far been able to focus on combating their virus relatively successfully without implementing economy-destroying measures. The main point of this article, I think, was not to say do nothing, as some commenters have suggested. Instead, the author is saying that maybe we should be focusing more on testing and protecting those most at risk. The economic and social costs of doing so would likely be far less than the current trajectory. So I thought that was interesting. And some of the comments were interesting, although, like I said, I don't know much about the comments, but the people who made the comments, including that last one. But so if you're interested, that's at Stat News, STAT News, NEWS.com, and the article's from John Ioannidis, who is, like I say, from Stanford University. So it was kind of a really of an interesting information. And the reason I say it's interesting is because his analogy about the elephant jumping off a cliff to avoid the house cat is I'm afraid where we're going right now. Some of the measures we're taking may make medical sense, but they do not make overall sense. They do not make economic sense for sure. If we end up driving our economy into a depression, and we're already borderline recession right now, in a matter of weeks, we've gone from one of the stronger economies we've ever had to one that's on the brink of recession. And if all of a sudden we throw that further into a depression, the results of that would be far, far worse than any even additional deaths that would be caused by COVID-19. And I say additional deaths because we have people dying every day from the flu, or from Hep A, not from Hep A, but are getting Hep A. But we have people dying from the flu on a regular basis. And so, those numbers and other respiratory illnesses. So, it's and here's what I think the problem is. I think doctors are good at evaluating risk in terms of in evaluating risk, but their tendency is to take measures that completely eliminate risk. And as a business person, and particularly in economics, in looking at the economics of business and things like that, you have to evaluate risk. Business people evaluate risk every single day, and they evaluate all kinds of risk. And what they have to do is decide not how they eliminate all of the risk, because if you eliminate all of your risk, you also eliminate all of your profit. And that's kind of a hard fact of the situation, is that if I eliminate all the risk, I'm most likely going to eliminate my ability to make money. And so as business people, we evaluate the risk all the time. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. We evaluate the risk of expansion and whether we'll be able to get financing to do that, whether we'll be able to get employees to do that. We have to evaluate the risk of getting the business and not being able to handle it, or handle it fast enough. My perfect example of that is most restaurants when they have their grand opening. How many restaurants do you see that when they have their grand opening, they underestimate how successful they're going to be, and all of a sudden they're overloaded that first 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week, and then people stop. So then they finally go out and hire the extra people and bring them in, and then all of a sudden everything dies off. Why? Because people went there, they tried it, they said the service is horrible, and I had to wait hours, and they don't come back, right? So in effect, that person made an evaluation of that risk, and if they were wrong and substantially wrong, they're out of business. I've seen. I'll just stay on the restaurant analogy. I love it that and they'll be out of business, and this has nothing to do with with the coronavirus, but there is a restaurant in town, a bagel shop, that is out of bagels by roughly 11, 12 o'clock every single day, probably earlier than that, most likely by 10. How can you be a bagel shop and be out of bagels at 10 o'clock in the morning, particularly on a Saturday or a Sunday? You can't. Why are they? Because an accountant is making the decisions behind the scenes, not a business person. And that accountant is saying, gee, if I'm being left with, I've got too many of this that I could potentially am being left with, or I don't want to be left with extra product because I lose money on that. So what I'm going to do is just do a little less. And then every week they do a little less, and they do a little less, and they don't adjust for things that are happening like parades and major events in Memorial Park or whatever. And the next thing you know, they have minimized their risk out of business. Because yes, if you don't produce any bagels, you will not lose any money from waste. You also will be out of business because you'll have zero sales. And the fact of the matter is that costs can only be reduced at a certain level. Sales can be increased infinitely if you handle it right. So business people make decisions. Accountants are not good risk evaluators. They really aren't, because they are not used to taking risks. They're used to finding ways to minimize risk. And I think doctors and health scientists are good at helping find ways to minimize risk to the point of eliminating it entirely. But at some point, do you eliminate it entirely? From an economic standpoint, somebody needs, and from an overall standpoint, somebody needs to step back and evaluate risk overall and say, yes, this coronavirus is at risk. I can eliminate it entirely. But if I do that, I put us out of business. The country goes down the hill. There's nothing left of it. Now, do I want to do that? I can do that. We've had, the head of the health area. I forget what the guy's name is. He's been on the news a bunch of times. He has said, "I'd rather overreact than underreact." That is a answer from a medical professional, and I understand. He would like to, and because he wants zero deaths, and I understand that. But the cost of zero deaths from the virus may be the cost of many, many, many more deaths from the economic devastation that occurs as a result of people losing all their jobs, their family, and everything else happening. So somebody has to take a bigger picture look at that's decent at evaluating risk, and they have to make a decision. And that won't be a good political decision, because with any of those decisions, it involves somebody getting an outcome that they don't want. I'm 64 years old. I really don't want to die. And I'm one of the people that be at risk. So, there's risk for me. But at the same time, I don't want to be alive if I can't afford to live. If I don't have a job and have an income, there's no money, there's no Social Security, there's nothing for me. What good's there to be around? I can't do anything anyway. My life would kind of be over. So the question is, what do you do at that level? I hate to say this, but it's somewhat true. It's the same decisions that a general makes at war. They know that they're going to lose lives. Nobody wants that, but they also know it's impossible to wage a war without losing lives. Because if you decide I'm going to wage a war without losing lives, you're not going to wage a war. So therefore, you're going to lose. And then the outcome of that is far worse than the deaths that occur in protecting your country. So, we have military that are capable of making some of those decisions. I think business people are better at making some of these decisions. For example, we can eliminate the risk of anybody getting the virus. We'll lock everybody up, make them stay home, shelter in place, all that kind of stuff. The rest of the economy will collapse, and we'll all have a devastating outcome of that, which will be far worse than the influenza would have ever been. So, or do we just restrict those that are most at risk? Do we shelter in place those that have the best chance of a worst case outcome? Those that are over 60, or those with over 60 with compromised immune systems, those over 70 and 80. Do we shelter in place those individuals? And at that point, do we let the rest of the virus run its course? Do we let the young people, the children, the people under 60, whatever, or the people that are 60 with decent health, do we let them run the course so that they do build up some potential resistance? I know we don't know that that's the case yet, but if it's run its course, it's gone through the system, there's much less likelihood of then us transmitting that to our the grandparents and the elder population, or carrying it someplace else. So, do we try to look at this instead of trying to mitigate all of the risk? Should we try to be mitigating and reducing risk to the level that is acceptable? And I know there will be people that say, well, no death is acceptable. But the fact of life is that everybody has to deal with death, and death is part of life. And everybody has to deal with that. We have accidents on the roadways every day. If you're going to eliminate all deaths, let's eliminate all car accidents. Let's make everybody not drive a car. Let's make it no cars, nobody's driving. There's a lot of things we can do to reduce total risk. The cost of that is far greater than the risk associated with it. But when it comes to evaluating lives, we tend to have a hard time with that. And I understand that. And that's why, it's hard to make those kind of decisions. It's interesting that when you talk about things like medical care, determining who gets what care is a decision has to be made relative to who you're going to allow to die. And that's a factor of managing medical care if you're going to manage it on a global basis, and not allow the individual to make the decision. It's the same thing here. If we manage this virus by telling people they cannot leave their house, then ultimately the outcome of that is not going to be good. We're going to force a lot of people into a situation that's going to result in a lot more epic deaths than this would, because of the desire to or because of what happens from economic devastation. You want to go back and look at what happened as a result of the 1918 flu, and the deaths that occurred there. Look at the crash of 29 and 30 and 31 and 32 and 33, and see how many deaths there were there. And I think, you'd be surprised to see that we had a lot more issues relative to that. And some of them were just, if you don't have money, you can't afford certain things. You can't afford health care. You can't afford all of that stuff. And you can say the government's going to provide that, but the government can't provide it if they don't have income. And they don't have income if there's no taxes. And there's no taxes if you're not working. So, it's kind of a situation where, realistically, um, it's got to be evaluated. There's risk associated with it. So, and we don't like to do that, and it's unpopular to make those decisions because there is no right answer. And I will say this is really the only political comment I'm going to make is that the fact of the matter is that probably President Trump is going to have to make this decision, and as a result, he is going to provide the fuel to his competition for him to not be elected because nobody likes a good decision or a bad decision that results in, and this is going to result in bad outcomes no matter what. It's just a question of how bad they are. And it's not an assured answer, as we heard from the statistics. There's no good statistics, so we don't really know. We're making a decision, a gut decision from relatively minimal statistics. We're trying to extrapolate that and determine risk, the risk of the virus versus the risk of a collapsed economy. There's no win-win in that situation. There is no good answer to that. The answer to that will only be borne out historically, long after Trump is out of office, long after the next person is in office. And so that's the thing. And here you want to talk about somebody not making a political decision. The person that's going to make this decision has got to make a decision that's probably going to mean that they're done with politics, because this is exactly the same as in terms of the type of decision as the politicians in Martin County and Stewart who would not even speak about the Virgin trains coming in. I know that's not the same situation, but it's the same concept. Certainly, we had the risk that train was going to go through. That risk was pretty high because we were getting numbers that were saying it was going to happen, right? So now you could mitigate that risk by getting a station, but not one single politician wanted to stand up and say, I'm in favor of a station, because they didn't want to be accused of being in favor of the train, and therefore they would not get reelected. And that's bottom line. That's what happens because politicians care about getting elected, and their decision-making factors that in. Whoever makes this decision has to eliminate the reelection decision. That is, the fact of the matter is it's unfortunate, but President Trump has inherited this. He has nothing to do with it. There is no right answer to it. There is and never was a right answer to it, and they can say whatever they want. But the bottom line is when he makes the decision, it will be the wrong decision in the minds of at least a percentage of the population, probably, half or more, because it may impact them differently. And so, and the people that are impacted positively by it are probably not going to see it, because either it's going to happen long after he's out of office, or it's going to not be correlated with his decision. People aren't going to realize that his decision is what saved the economy or caused the economy not to crash another 50%. See, that's the thing. How do you show that you stop something from happening if it doesn't happen? In other words, let's say that the potential is that we would have gone into a Great Depression, that more than half the businesses would fail, that local businesses would fail, that property would go into foreclosure, and that everybody would be in a state of devastation, like the crash of '29, and people would be lined up in soup lines. If you make a decision and that doesn't happen because of the decision you made, but people die, but it doesn't happen, that devastation doesn't happen, you can't say, see, that didn't happen. Well, everybody's going to say, well, it wouldn't have happened anyway, you dummy. And so, they're going to say, you caused a bunch of people to die for nothing. Well, yeah, that's it. There is no answer because there's no way you can prove that. And that is, there's no way that, because at some point somebody will have to take some action. And so here we are in a situation where the only way you can prove what would have been the good solution is to take the bad solution and end up with a bad outcome. So, I guess the only correct answer here is going to be an I told you so answer. And that I told you so answer is going to be well past the time of the next election. So, I feel bad for the president because, and for, Congress will bury this stuff. They'll, they're going to get reelected. Congress could care less. I mean, they care, but let's face it, none of them have to individually stand up and say, this is my decision. I'm going to do this. They're going to vote. They're going to say why they didn't vote or did vote, but they can hide in the vote. It's just one vote that they take of many votes. And so they don't have to bear the brunt of this. One person is going to bear the brunt of this, and that is President Trump. And it's unfortunate, but he is going to bear the brunt of it. And, history will tell whether he made the right decision or not. But I can tell you the elections probably won't, because this decision that's got to be made, and it's got to be made now, is going to be devastating. Because if we continue the path we're going, and by the time that people realize that the solution that was proposed didn't produce the answer that they wanted, we'll be well into an economic recession that everybody will be able to see. Because this and it amazes me, recessions generally take a long time to happen. And that's why I wasn't concerned about this virus from an economic standpoint. In fact, I've told clients to buy. It's a buying opportunity. And it still is, because the chances of us going fully under is still minimal. And the fact is, because the result of this is of this economic thing is not bad business, but rather a virus that would go away. When it goes away, business should recover. In fact, it should come back stronger, because there is a lot of pent up demand. The housing market should come back faster, and a lot of things. Nobody's looking at houses now. They should be. It's a good opportunity, but nobody is, because people are all afraid. They're all sitting at home. Frankly, some people aren't selling their homes today because of that. So bottom line is, when the economy recovers, it should recover fast, and it should be solid. It should be a very good recovery, because there was nothing wrong with the economy to start with. It was all about this virus and the restrictions placed on by this virus. But like I said, it's one of those kind of things that by the time people sit there and realize what is happening, it's going to be too late to protect or to make sure that the current situation, the president is not going to have anything to look to at that point. So I'm not optimistic, and I, it's ironic that our economy is the best it's ever been. And it really is. And I mean, I see it as a CPA, and I was upset because previously the small business economy wasn't as good as it could have been. And especially the financing side of it was not as good as it could have been. And I've been warning for a long time that the weakness in our economy is financing. There's still no loans out there. There's still no money out there. And this isn't going to get better. If I've talked to a couple business owners, and they have decent sized businesses, not small, not 500 employees or more. They're in this, area where they could potentially, they told me, Mark, 2 weeks worth of pay is $100,000. I don't have 100,000 sitting in the bank. And if I have to go get it out of my retirement account, I'm going to lose 30% of the value. I won't be able to retire at all. I mean, I would have to sell my business to have money to retire. So, that's kind of where we're at. I want people to think a little bit about the fact that we have to evaluate risk. And this is a tough one, but we have to evaluate risk, because there are risks in here that we can see, the death from the viruses, and there are risks that we can't see, the deaths from the devastation of the economy. So keep that in mind. Somebody's got to make that decision, and we've got to get people out there. Don't fail from this. Help the small business people. Stay out there. If you're not at risk, stay out there and help out. Anyway, I appreciate you joining me here this morning. I appreciate your coming on WSTU Digital 1450. We are Martin County's very old station.